Everyone, so it is 3 o'clock and we're going to get started. My name is Emily Esten and I'd like to welcome you all physically and virtually. I'm here to Studio B for You Can't Handle the Post-Truth. I want to start off with two things. So one is a territorial land acknowledgement. So here at the museum, what is currently the Museum of the Moving Image in New York City, we are located on stolen, unceded Lenape, Canarsie, or Matinecock land. This area was home to many Native peoples. And I also want to start off with the idea of timekeeping as feminist pedagogy. This is an idea that comes from my friend Danica Savanik. And this is essentially that this is your time as much as it is the presenter's time, so everyone has an equal amount of time to present. And we're not going to take up too much time with questions, making sure this is a space for everyone to participate. So changes in how we produce and distribute information have sparked a growing anxiety over the nature of truth and the means of contesting it. After quick introductions of each of our panelists, they will each have 12 minutes to talk about their work related to truth and post-truth, from UFOs to deepfakes, identity to self-tracking technologies. And then after their presentations, we'll open up the floor to questions and discussion. So Sun-Ha Hong looks at the speculations, fantasies, and all the other non-rational aspects of the new data-driven rationalities. His book, Fabrications, Knowledge and Uncertainty in a Data-Driven Society, is forthcoming with NYU Press, and he is an assistant professor of communication at Simon Fraser University. Stephanie Monohan is a writer, illustrator, and youth culture researcher for MTV. She is currently pursuing a master's in media, culture, and communication at NYU Steinhardt, and her work focuses on the intersections of technology, horror, and capitalism. Maggie MacDonald is completing her master's in media studies at Concordia University. She researches pornography as a cultural industry with a focus on platformization and how this process influences content and production conditions. And Jared Newman is an analyst at BetaWork Ventures. He joined BetaWork Ventures in 2017, where he sources and evaluates investments and predicts market trends. He studied English literature and data science at Yale University. So without further ado, Sun-Ha, do you want to start?
Okay, let's go. Hi everyone. So I'm here to connect some dots. Connecting the dots is what data analysts love to do, right? They say the dots are the data points, you connect enough of them, enough times, and you're going to get all these insights. You're going to be able to predict the future. You're going to be able to catch that terrorist. And what I want to do here is connect some dots about what's going on in the data-driven society right now, especially about how our desire for truth through technology is producing some, shall we say, unexpected consequences. So for me, that means looking at two things that look pretty different at the outset. One is relatively celebrated, that is the rise of self-tracking and other forms of smart machines. I say relatively celebrated. And the other is relatively condemned, right? The rise of political disinformation. So you see what I mean here by relatively. And I think the common theme here, the connection here is what we might call personal truth-making, which means an individualistic approach or style that says technology is going to empower people to know their truth, that they're going to know it better than the experts, that there's going to be this cynical and aggressive opposition to institutional forms of truth. So let's get to it straight away. Scene one is smart machines for self-tracking, and the technological fantasy here, I think at this point is familiar to all of us when we look at Fitbit, Apple Watch, and so on. Big data is passé, the idea goes. The contrarian cool is with small data. You want the n equals 1. You want to measure your exercise. You want to track your sleep. You want to analyze your productivity. You want to take pictures of your shit. This one's called Poo Keeper. You can't see it very well, but and you also want to get an app to listen to you having sex so that you can measure things like thrusts per minute. Sadly, this particular app's gone defunct, but don't worry, there's plenty of other competitors for you to download. So we're supposed to do this, connect all of these dots in our lives in order to discover the unique truths about you and nobody else because you're special, and use that data to ping, nudge, gamify yourself to a better place. So implicit here is a seemingly very empowering message, right? That you can know yourself in a way the experts cannot. Take the case of Larry Smarr, who is widely known amongst tracking enthusiasts. What Smarr did was make a 3D model, a giant 3D model of his own gut microbiota. So here you can see Larry swimming around in his own gut. And he says that tracking his own gut in this way allowed him to predict the onset of Crohn's disease in himself before the doctors could. So Larry talks about the limitations of the doctor-patient relationship. He talks about how you've got to take control and you've got to make your own decisions. And for me, there's a weird resonance here, because if we go back right to 1784, just for kicks, if we go right back to the very start of what we call the Enlightenment, you listen to Immanuel Kant saying, what is the Enlightenment? You need to overcome. What do you overcome? You overcome an immaturity. What do you mean by that? Well, it's an immaturity in which, for example, a doctor judges my diet for me. Now, I'm not saying that Immanuel Kant is a proto-anti-vaxxer who thinks that we don't need to listen to the doctors. That's not what he's saying, right? So there's a complicated relationship between how we're supposed to know for ourselves while also listening to objective reason. So there's a conflict between that goes back all the way through the history of the Enlightenment, all the way through the slogan, sapere aude, the idea that we're supposed to have the courage to use our own understanding. Now, the trick here is Larry Smarr just happens to be a director at Cal IT 2. He just happens to be one of the pioneers in supercomputing technologies. In other words, he's got the money, he's got the time, he's got the giant-ass room to put his gut in triple XL, he's got the tech savvy, he's got everything he needs to pursue this kind of empowerment. For the rest of us, the selling point of a lot of these devices, especially the mass market versions, is they say they're going to collect the kind of data that lies beyond our sensory capabilities. So yeah, I'm sure I could draw pictures of my shit for myself instead of using an app. But if we're looking at something like galvanic skin conductance, what is it? GSR. Galvanic skin response, which is the electrical conductance on your skin at all times, your own senses simply has no access to that kind of information, right? So there's a weird kind of flip here where the kind of personal empowerment that we're supposed to get through this self-knowledge, it happens by empowering a new set of machines to create and administer this personalized information about us. Now, this shouldn't surprise us at all. It really shouldn't surprise us because it's a persistent pattern in technologies of datafication. We saw it with Google and Amazon and corporate data mining, where personalization was supposed to mean, convenience, personal choice, but we also got was surveillance, manipulation, and social sorting, right? So in the world of data, there's always a fine print to the promise of the personal. And it's the kind of fine print that the human senses don't have the equipment to sense at all. So what we can do here is fast forward a few years, and there's another type of bad personalization, or so we say, that is going on, right? This idea that we've got all the fake news, we're falling into our own filter bubbles and rabbit holes. It's a world of delusions curated by YouTube algorithms. Now, of course, misinformation and disinformation has been around at least as long as mass media. At least, 100 years before, we've already got this kind of concern around the sensationalist newspapers. So this is not just a new technological shift. One of the things that this is grounded in is a generational decline, a massive decline in our trust for institutions, including the media, but also including things like the US Supreme Court. So there's a vacuum in trust. And what happens there is what Lisbeth Van Zunen called epistemology. It's this idea that individuals feel like they can find their own way to the truth. You see this in someone like the Charleston shooter, whose manifesto describes his own radicalization. He says, I started on this path by searching the simple words black on white crime. And we know there are numerous problems with how that phrase becomes used and so on and so forth. But the point here is that he was trying to do exactly what we try and teach people to do, which is consult multiple sources of information, right? Try to discover unlikely connections. Try to make up your own mind. You can see a similar pattern for the man who shot up the pizza restaurant because his research led him to believe that Pizzagate was real. And later, he's in court and he brings a handwritten letter to apologize. And he says, I'm sorry, I just wanted to help people. I'm sorry I got it wrong. And he describes it as bad intel. And what I noticed there is this idea that the very idea of getting intel and going in there and taking action is not necessarily problematized, right? It's only that the particular intel that he got was bad that is problematized in this kind of language. So here we find what Dana Boyd calls the backfire of media literacy. It's not that these people ran away from the truth. The problem is that they leaned into the truth in a problematic way. They had this confidence that they could read enough, learn enough, and process it in a rational way. And so amongst the alt-right and the far-right, you've got this meme that you need to red pill yourself, right? That's the language. So the language there is you've got to wake up. And obviously, we saw in the movie, there's no real choice, right? Nobody ever thinks about taking the blue pill in the movie. Everybody always takes the red pill. They always wake up. They always suffer for it. But then they are always able to overcome it with their power of slow-mo kung fu. And so, in the same way, there's this kind of alt-right rhetoric that you can have the power. But the thing here is, with self-tracking, we saw that the ostensible emancipation through self-knowledge actually becomes rerouted through this new class of technological mediators, the smart machines and the corporations behind them. And with the alt-right too, and with this kind of fake news as well, you've got a new set of mediators. So let's connect that dot. The Pizzagate shooter, we know, was an avid subscriber to Alex Jones's InfoWars. And here I think we find another business dimension to the whole picture. Now, Alex Jones, we all know as a crazy conspiracy theorist who is full of self-righteous masculine anger. He's really good at being angry. On any given day, he can be found yelling, screaming, and roaring about how angry he is. So this is part of his brand, and he is very, very skilled at this. He's very, very good at it. But another key element here is that influencers like Alex Jones or some of the YouTube micro-celebrities, they will consistently claim that they are the rational ones. They are the ones that go for scientific evidence. Alex Jones loves to show you all the documents that he has when he's doing his show. The trick is that half of his documents are actually his own website articles that he's printed out, so there's a kind of a self-citation loop going on there. But he likes to claim the legacy of the Enlightenment is the point I'm trying to make, right? The common refrain that these influencers have is they don't say you must believe in X, you must believe in X. No, they say, I'm just giving you the facts. I'm giving you the facts that the mainstream media won't give you, and I respect you to go and make up your own mind, which some of the listeners feel is less patronizing than what they might get on the New York Times or the CNN. So there's a certain gesture towards, again, the legacy of the Enlightenment. This is further complicated by the commercialized structure of the truth-making. Alex Jones isn't just a fearless truth speaker. He's also a topless vitamin peddler. He wants to sell you super male vitality for a very high price in order to restore your threatened masculinity. He also wants to sell you happies. So this is a kind of an overture to the alternative wellness market that you see with things like Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop. So the conspiracy theory is directly leveraged to shift the goods. It's about using fake news to sell fake pills. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but let's hear it from his own
many
mouth.
revolutionaries rob banks and things and kidnap people for funds. We promote in the free market the products we use that are about preparedness. That's how we fund this revolution against the New World Order.
So, it reads very much like a cross between televangelists and infomercials, and late-night infomercials. And here is the question here. It's the same question that we've been asking about Donald. Exposing someone's financial conflict of interest used to be a way to discredit them as an objective truth teller. Now, if that rule is gone, what do you do? How do you adapt to this new world order? So, can you really win this battle for reason by showing how transparent and independent your fact checkers are when that may not be the rule by which the game is played these days? So just to wrap up here, today we often say truth is in crisis, and with the marches for science, we saw this kind of exasperation. People saying, oh my God, haven't we sorted this out? Isn't truth just truth? And Rudy Giuliani has the answer for you, right? Truth isn't truth, apparently. That was the quote. So there's a struggle over what counts as truth today. And I'd like to point out here that it's not simply a struggle between those who believe in science and reason and those who believe in anger and hate. No, both sides are trying to claim the mantle of the Enlightenment, the mantle of science, and both sides are trying to say the data and technology are on their side. So to me, it's a very twisted, strange kind of Enlightenment where the call to know for yourself doesn't unify us, but becomes weaponized against each other. And so the question here that I'll end with is, how do we restore and create a new public consensus around what kinds of people and things can be trusted? Do we do that by going back to the old school version of journalism and science? But isn't that another version of MAGA where we say back in the day science and journalism was perfect, which it wasn't? Or do we have to go on and create some new rules of the game for what counts as true and what counts as trustworthy online? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maggie, do you want to go next?
I also want to thank my co-presenters and Emily for chairing our panel today. Thanks everyone in the room. So in 2016, Rogue One concluded with a shot where audiences found themselves face to face with Princess Leia, who took the form of a 19-year-old Carrie Fisher from 1977's A New Hope. Now this cameo was made possible through Lucasfilm using original footage overlaid over a Norwegian actor's face, and the same effect was used to insert Peter Cushing into the film. Other impossible cameos in the last couple of years have come in the form of Paul Walker's farewell scene in Furious 7, or Audrey Hepburn trying to sell us chocolate in a Dove commercial. And this overlay effect used to require dedicated teams, technical expertise, a huge budget. But if you flash forward to 2019, audiences no longer rely on Hollywood for this effect. Deepfakes has become the term used to describe these clips. And that's after a Reddit user who circulated many of the earliest videos back in 2017 and consolidated the process into an easy-to-use app. So now the technique has worked its way across message boards the world over. If you're not familiar, this is a quick demonstration. It's horrifying. Yeah. So thanks to free apps like FaceSwap and FakeApp, anyone can now train a neural network to make a deepfake using a home computer, some publicly available videos, photos, some spare time. So after extracting a data set and training image nodes to arrange themselves against a source video, the manipulated result, as you can see, is eerie and virtually indistinguishable in some cases from real footage. Now, probably unsurprisingly, this technique has been put to use in pursuit of maybe the internet's favorite preoccupation, online pornography. And so 2018 brought on something of a Cambrian explosion of deepfakes, featuring popular starlets in pornographic scenes to which they virtually never consent. Now, one look at the headlines covering deepfakes makes it very clear that they're being received as heralding something of a moral apocalypse, and they all tend to warn vaguely but very alarmingly that AI-assisted porn is here and we're all fucked. So what I'm here to talk about today is that this framing forgets a very crucial point, and that is that machine learning technologies are neutral. They're tools that can be employed for good or for nefarious purposes. And the use of this highly rhetorical, emotive language really creates the effect that something has to be done about it in our social consciousness in dangerous ways. Now, Angela McRoby and Sarah Thornton have talked about this extensively, the ways in which moral panic have created a reinforcement of the status quo. It's a process by which politicians, commercial producers, and large media habitually attempt to incite that control by naming this sort of distinct external threat. And so taking a look at those headlines makes that tactic very clear in this case. The thing is, by framing the problem as technology spelling the end of truth and morality, moral panic really forecloses the debate around the true origins of the problem with making deepfakes. And it really creates this kind of technophobic fallacy that seems to be the only thing people are talking about. Moral panic mistakes technologies, and in this case that's face swap and fake app, as sort of the etiology for what feels violating about the practice itself. It doesn't help that pornography is kind of the perfect vehicle for moral panic. We've all seen this time and time again. Like Laura Kipnis, for example, reminds us that it is the specter, quote, summoned over and over again as the thing good culture has to dedicate itself to repelling, for the purpose of staging a symbolic and ritualistic public cleansing. So despite the positive capacity and potential for porn to make expressive space for all sorts of alternative sexualities, it's largely been the subject of scorn and panic in the media. And deepfakes are no exception to this rule. They confront the idea of a moral economy, which is to say the presumed ethical and normal relationships between media producers and consumers. So when it comes to articulating what exactly is unethical about deepfake porn, specific ideological concerns tend to be subsumed into the general shame and disgust we feel towards pornography and the general paranoia that we see aimed at tech. So framing this problem as the end of truth marginalizes gender and sexuality in our understanding of political economy of the internet, for one. Whereas deepfakes could be understood as a case study for the productivity of desire and the way that it can really animate the way that we produce new media. So I want to be really clear in making this point that face-swapped porn is very upsetting in its implications, and it harms people, and it especially harms women. But it's technically not a privacy issue, because unlike leaked nudes or revenge porn, the most popular precedents cited when it comes to deepfakes, this kind of material is completely fabricated from publicly available images in almost all cases. So there is one precedent for this sort of creation and circulation of content. And because of that, I think it's worth considering deepfakes instead through the lens of convergence culture. Some of you may be familiar with Henry Jenkins, who points out that convergence culture is a chimera of techniques and technologies. It represents the flow of content across platforms, as well as the migratory behavior of audiences equipped to consume as well as produce their own content. So borrowing content from very disparate sources is very typical of participatory cultures. And in this ecosystem, you see audiences constantly constructing and reshaping their own media to serve their interests. You see this in all sorts of fan communities. You see it with AMVs, fan art, film remakes, or film tributes. And this kind of circuit of simultaneous production and consumption depends very heavily on a very engaged audience participation. So the producer-consumer, or as Henry Jenkins calls them, the prosumers, represent a shift in cultural logic. So consumers are encouraged to seek out new information and make connections between very disparate media objects, which is exactly what we're seeing with deepfakes. So in this emerging media ecosystem, porn consumers become the porn producers. And they're merged into this pool of interaction that entirely ignores the traditional media divides that we have seen in porn making. And as prosumers, you could consider deepfake makers to be hybridizing content because they're really harnessing the technique's potential to be making anything real. And they're gesturing towards what they want to see in their media. It's a new form of expression. So it should be noted that porn sharing communities have been observed historically to act kind of like fans across the board. Because unlike with studio-produced porn, there's sort of this free and gift economy that really flourishes amongst deepfakes, and it creates a really high engagement in porn-sharing communities. R.I.P. Tumblr. But on the now defunct deepfake subreddit, some users even were pushing back against the idea that what they were doing was a harmful practice. A user with the handle Gravity Horse claimed, quote, "The work that we create in this community is not with malicious intent. Quite the opposite. We're painting with revolutionary experimental technology that could quite possibly shape the future of media and creative design." So I think it's clear that this suggests a community that does not recognize itself in that apocalyptic headline that we saw earlier, and it really doesn't understand the problems with the media making practices that it's engaged with. We really could have predicted this sort of adaptive porn prosumer, even out of the immense popularity that we saw in porn GIF and video sharing across forums in the past. Porn scholar Helen Hester has actually defended these communities as exemplary spaces for participatory interaction, which is very, very much at odds with our vision of the porn consumer as this kind of passive, thoughtless, completely receptive, unthinking Neanderthal. So the tactics of deepfake prosumers are not actually surprising. They emerge out of a convergence culture, and they're very enmeshed in the world of porn production, which is a huge cultural industry that it is riddled with piracy, and it's largely historically unconcerned with protecting, especially women's bodily integrity. So this framing really troubles also sort of the asexual nature of participatory culture studies, and I think it's important to remind that Henry Jenkins himself was very interested in desire and sexuality and fandom, which is something that, as a larger field of study, has been largely abandoned. So I'd like to talk about fans, because rather than misunderstanding these kind of new and emerging practices, I think we can consider the histories of fan and porn communities, because borrowing and modularizing celebrities is a porn trick that deepfakes did not invent, they inherited. So if you look back at the Tijuana Bibles of the early 20th century, or more recently, the popularization of erotic fan fiction, we can see that audiences have long been eager to consume the private sex lives of celebrities like Mae West or Clark Gable, or the members of One Direction, or Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And I think these really represent links in the tradition of fan creations that depict sexual encounters to which the subjects did not give their consent. But still, it's important to note that audiences have been expected to be able to distinguish those kind of earlier romps from what we see today. They used to consider them expression, or satire, or creativity, because unlike their predecessors in fairness, deepfakes are a technological triumph over the eye, and the fear tends to be that they will be mistaken for capital R real. But I think it also is important to remind that despite our trust in the truth-making power of images, deepfakes only represent an era of post-truth if you believe that images represented truth in the first place, that they naively capture this idea of truth instead of producing and structuring truth as they are captured and circulated across different mediums. So, platforms are responding. And I think it should be clear that a video itself does not need to be real in order for the damages that it incurs to be. Again, I want to keep reminding that we are not here to minimize the consequences of deepfakes. But practically, there are not very many recourses for victims of a deepfake. This is a huge part of why the practice took off so explosively, because enthusiasts very quickly realized that nothing about making the videos is explicitly illegal as of this point. And there's also no straightforward route for having them taken off of their platforms, given they've got this process of free circulation, anonymous content creation, and their ability to sort of magically and perpetually reappear. It's a game of deepfake whack-a-mole. Now, legislatures have had basically no time to catch up with what deepfake makers are doing, let alone to craft anything approaching an appropriate response. But bear in mind that policy has historically never kept up with porn-making practices, regardless of the type of technology involved. So until policymakers catch up, the responsibility for regulation has fallen entirely to platforms. So we're looking at content hosts like Reddit and Discord, and obviously porn providers like Pornhub. Now, this is really slippery to consider these platforms as players for a couple of reasons. First, why aren't we regulating deepfakes as hate speech? Now, the legal status of hate speech means that frequently the content threshold is too high. Platforms should not need their content to tip into the criminal in order to be moderating, and imagining this audience, there's no need to remind you that there's a whole host of platform scholarship out there that has very convincingly proven time and time again that platforms are constantly moderating. It's just that the moderation of deepfakes in particular is not incentivized. Because deepfakes like coordinated harassment, targeted intimidation, or disinformation are not technically criminal. But they can and they should be moderated. So defamation and copyright law could be a great place to start. But Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, commonly called Safe Harbor, that's been discussed here today, gives broad protection to the platforms hosting this content, stating that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information provider. And that basically ensures that platforms are immune from liability for hosting deepfakes, but they can still profit off the content being hosted. So they're putting the onus back on the uploaders, who remain entirely anonymous. And platforms should not have the onus placed on them anyways to determine these regulatory frameworks based on their individual terms of service. We should definitely not be deputizing privately held companies to set precedents about media regulation. Because ultimately deepfake videos grab attention, and when it comes to Pornhub and other content hosts, they profit not from the individual quality of images, but from this relentless churn of traffic across the sites. And the system is really incentivizing the continued hosting of inappropriate grabs. So the outrage and injury caused by this practice is very real, but we have to explore its preconditions. And I just want to close by saying, concern levied at deepfakes is completely not undeserved, and the videos have consequences, but treating this as an unprecedented moral problem that's brought about by a new change in technology is a very troubling red herring. Now, framing them as the exception rather than the rule detracts from these underlying cultural devaluation of consent and bodily autonomy, and the problem is not unique to deepfakes, it's not even unique to pornography, it saturates our social and cultural and political life. What deepfakes do is reveal underlying problems with platform regulation and a culture unconcerned with consent, but they also show an account of porn consumers as enthusiastic participants in convergence culture, who just inherited a very complicated history of porn-making practices. And so deepfakes, like all pornography, will continue to unsettle stable notions of taste, but I think looking a little bit beyond the panicky headlines can help us understand these transgressive practices as part of convergence culture, instead of continuing to proliferate them as this seedy, unregulated specter of moral panic.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Stephanie, do you want to go next?
Hi, thanks for having me. We're talking about UFOs. And I'm going to read off of my phone, which is not ideal for me, but it's what I got, so bear with me. Well, I'll start with the story. This past winter, I was at a holiday party in Kew Gardens, and it was, I only knew a few people, and every part of the evening was entirely average until the entire sky turned this aqua blue. Some of you may have seen this if you were in the city. And it was really bizarre, and I found the moment really fascinating because although it was really strange, and it was almost like someone flicked a light switch on the sky and then turned it off again 10 minutes later, people were pretty calm about the whole thing. But it was this immediately social event where everyone immediately hopped on Twitter and Citizen and tried to like crowdsource an answer for what the hell was happening in the sky, and could really only come down to self-deprecating, ironic jokes about, well, I guess the aliens are here, and this year sucked anyway, so why not just be abducted by aliens? And remarkably, it didn't really make too many waves in like the UFO community. This was a very mainstream sort of fun discourse around it. But it really spoke to me, and it kind of inspired this research because I'm interested way less in whether or not UFOs are real, sort of. I kind of want to know if they're real. But more about what's seeing and documenting UFOs, as well as the decline in concentration on UFOs in a time where we're seeing lots more conspiratorial thinking, especially online, is becoming more prominent, and what that reveals about our social lives and how we understand our relationship to power and conspiracy. And I think a running theme through all of these presentations is none of these questions about truth are totally new. And people have been looking at inexplicable things in the sky forever, for as long as there have been people. And for as long as we've had any technological capabilities to document them, we've been trying to capture the things we see and even the things that we cannot see. And this is really, this is a picture of the sky. I meant to show you that. This was really prescient this week because we got the first image of a black hole, or what scientists are deducing is a black hole. And the black hole photo is really interesting to me, and I'm really selfishly happy that this happened this week so I could put it in here. But even with the amount of coding and technological coordination it took to turn radio wave data into this image, it still has the same haunting quality, in my mind at least, to a lot of the early photography that captured otherworldly things. So this is what's considered by many ufologists to be the first UFO photograph. This was taken on August 12th, 1883, by a Mexican astronomer named Jose Bonilla. And he took a series of photographs through his telescope at an observatory over the course of 2 days, and he saw these formations of these fuzzy round objects in front of the sun. And I don't know what those are, and they're probably not a UFO, but that is considered the first UFO photograph. And both of these images, despite the vast differences between them and in terms of cultural context and the technology that was available at the time and scientific knowledge, still really captured this esoteric power of photography. So whether it's 1883 or 2019, to the layperson, the processes involved in capturing these images may as well be magic. And the images these processes capture speak to what Henry Bergson described as the threshold that's standing between us and the abstractions we use to represent ourselves. So the image is a window, a doorway, a passage between the flesh of our existence and the cluttered forest of signs we have invented to communicate our inchoate selves. And kind of similar to the Victorian era of spirit photography, there's this aura in the early UFO photos, more lights, orbs in the sky sort of photos that speak to this porousness between the material world that's around us and something else, no matter what that something else is. And UFO photography became a very social kind of media, even right before the Cold War era, namely with the account of this pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who in 1947 inaugurated the modern era of UFOs. And he told newspapers that he saw 9 metallic objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. And he described them as like saucers skipping over water. So although he didn't capture what he saw on camera, this description of the objects created the image of the flying saucer, which, among many other UFO accounts, spread more widely than ever before due to the growth of the communications industry. So after this, you start to see what we now are easily able to identify as hoaxes or staged photographs, doctored photographs. Flying saucers, they're vastly different from the earlier kinds of hovering light orb photography. However, I don't think these two types of images should really be considered that distinct from one another. They both have a profound sort of resonance for people who viewed them and continue to view them today, and the effect that they've had on not just conspiratorial thinking and people's processing of their relationship to power, and in turn their powerlessness, should be explored. And I really like them, even though they're totally fake looking. I think that they're really powerful and interesting. So William Gibson wrote the introduction to this book about UFO photography a few years ago, and he told this story about his mother's encounter with a flying saucer. And this would have happened, he said it was shortly after his birth, so it would have been between 1948 and 1950, which was a year after Kenneth Arnold saw his UFOs and right at the beginning of the Cold War. So a lot of these ideas were becoming very viral and popular at the time. And he said that he kept pressing her for information about the UFOs, but he kept coming back to just the material realities of their life there in Oak Ridge, and said, "Today I believe she had been infected in her loneliness by anxiety, what we now think of as a meme." And he always gets it right. But I do think he articulates something very key here, which is this infection, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, more of this virality of paranoia, which of course was a huge part of the Cold War era, but has never really gone away. And unlike a lot of conspiracy theory communities that we're seeing more and more of today, the UFO community has been sharing images and testimonies and theories, networking themselves long before the commercial internet existed. And newspapers and talk radio helped a lot with this. So the current panic over sudden decay in truth and facts, and I think a lot of people in this room would agree with this, is it's not only a bit overblown, but it's also a really ahistorical claim. But I don't necessarily want to just flat out say UFOs are not quote unquote real in the same way that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying ghosts are not real. Not comfortable saying that. Because even if they hypothetically aren't material objects, they're used consciously or not as social objects by many people to articulate not only fear and paranoia, but desire for the world that they want to live in. And they expand aperture on the world for people about the powers that be, or more conspiratorial communities like flat earthers, you'll hear powers that should not be is the term thrown around. And they raise real questions about what should have been there instead. However, historical examples of translating this into a materialist analysis of society are few and far between. One that I want to note, an interesting example, is the Fourth International Posadist in Argentina. If there's any people who know a lot about like Trotskyist, I saw someone nodding, Trotskyist groups. So they were informed by these 1960s writings by J. Posadas, and he synthesized communist Trotskyist politics with ufology, claiming that aliens visiting Earth show us a socially and technologically advanced society that can only exist in a post-capitalist world. So they don't stay here and show us how to do that because they're disgusted with what we've done to the planet and society. And in her book, The Resonance of Unseen Things, Susan Lepselter spent years researching UFO believers in Rachel, Nevada, which is a place practically ablaze with affect from the legacy of Area 51. She writes extensively about how UFOs and abduction experiences come so close to naming capital as what explains their disillusionment and alienation from their government and even from the land that they live on, but for some reason cannot cut through to class consciousness. And she even draws this really powerful connection to me where UFO believers are really getting this image of like postmodern power that's really dispersed, doesn't have any material constraints, but for some reason aliens need the physical human body to extract us of some sort of labor, but that never quite translates into some sort of material world analysis. And as she goes on to notice something that you'll see now today is once believers come together and discuss these forms of invisible power and the uncanny sense the truth is being obfuscated by some sort of force they can't see, they don't tend to arrange themselves and relate to each other according to left or right political wings, but always around the idea of invisible centers of power. So for as old as UFO conspiracy is, its contours and, I want to use the word method, have a better grip on understanding how power and capital are functioning in the 21st century, highly technological, dispersed, decentralized, therefore obfuscated, and heavily networked and global. And abduction narratives follow this functioning of discipline dispersed all over the world in a truly eerie way. But as we're confronted with surveillance and violence happening every day on an unprecedented network scale, and now we've acquiesced to significant control of our bodies and our locations, our data, what role is there now for UFO conspiracy? And the National UFO Reporting Center reported a decrease in UFO sightings since 2014, but there are still moments like that of December 27th, 2018, with the big blue light in the sky over Astoria, where we are right now, where, cloaked in humor and self-deprecation are a ton of tweets about how shitty 2018 was, how little hope there is for things to get better, for the powers that should not be to work as we want them to, and at the very least for the subways to not crumble. So people collectively, even in an ironic way, sort of exhaled and was like, oh, they're finally here to just like take us from this. And however, our bubbles collectively burst when we soon found out that the source of the ghostly light was just a Con Ed transformer explosion, which was a very ironic malfunctioning of the very device that harnesses the power of high voltage electricity and disperses it out to the networks of your home. So if there's any sort of better metaphor for this connection, I'm not sure what it is. But that's really all I got. These have been a lot of ideas and formations, so thank you for bearing with me on them.
Thank you so much. And Jared, do you want to come finish?
Hey everybody. Thank you to my co-panelists. I am not nearly as brilliant as them. I have to admit, I'm actually a non-traditional speaker for an event like this. I am not an academic. I do not come from academia. I'm a venture capitalist, which, boo, yes. But as part of my job, I'm really interested in how capitalists and consumers' choices create and enable social phenomena. So I hope I can provide some sort of interesting insight or even unique perspective into something that I happen to have helped create that may or may not be problematic. So this talk is about virtual celebrities, and it presupposes that the study of representations and ideologies ascribed onto them is both valid and important to understanding how we frame social being and interaction. Of course, representations on social media, like representations on television, movies, or digital games, are not authentic depictions of reality, but they are not without their importance. Like other media, they supply images and frameworks that help to inform social life. So I'm going to actually start with an image. How many of you know who this is? Ugh, amazing. The fun part about being in venture capital is you can give a presentation like this, put up a photo of an Amazon Alexa, and the crowd roars. And you put up this, and people are stunned. So I'm really glad that I'm working at this high bar. So Lil Michaela is the first computer-generated social media influencer with 1.5 million followers on Instagram. She's designed, built, and managed by Brood, which is a venture-backed company out of Los Angeles that's currently worth around $125 million. And just as a disclosure, BetaWorks and the company that I work for is not an investor in any of the characters I'll be talking about today. So at first glance or swipe, Michaela could understandably be mistaken for a living, breathing person. She wears real-life clothes, buys streetwear brands like Supreme and luxury labels like Chanel. She hangs out with real-life musicians. I'll show you a photo later. Artists and influencers in real-life trendy restaurants. You can find her in New York. You can find her in Los Angeles, where she quote-unquote lives. And when Michaela holds her phone to a mirror, her reflection stares right back. When she is photographed in the daylight, her body casts a shadow. It's pretty weird. How many of you recognize this account? Awesome. So just one. So Shudu is an Instagram model with 167,000 followers. Her feed is scattered with various editorial images accompanied by #melanin hashtags. She was reposted on Fenty Beauty's Instagram account wearing the lipstick shade Sauce C. Most of it, if not all of her followers, cannot tell that she, like Michaela, is 100% CGI. She was created by a British photographer, white photographer named Cameron James Wilson. And in an interview with Harper's Bazaar last year, he said, quote, "Basically, Shudu is my creation. She's my art piece that I'm working on at a moment. As a photographer, I work with lots of different people all the time, real people that have inspired her. At the end of the day, it's a way for me to express my creativity. It's not trying to replace anyone. It's only trying to add the kind of movement that's out there," he clarified. It's, quote, "meant to be beautiful art which empowers people. It's not trying to take away an opportunity from anyone or replace anyone. She's trying to complement those people." So some problematic statements coming from a white photographer who made this black CGI model with 167,000 followers on Instagram and deals with Fenty Beauty. So these are just an array of the virtual celebrities that you can now find on Instagram. Shudu and Michaela were some of the first. There are now hundreds of these CGI influencers with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of followers on Instagram, who may or may not know that these characters are not real. And a new paradigm, I would argue, is needed to approach these conduits as these virtual celebrities as conduits of representation. The racial identities of Michaela and Shudu, both explicitly racial identities, perpetuate a, quote, post-racial ideology and highlight, and highlight the construction of, quote, biological race, using it as a marketing tool rather than unpacking or critiquing it. Michaela's creators have deliberately visualized her embodiment and outright called her, quote, ambiguously racial, simultaneously playing into and playing with notions of biological determinism and racism grounded in the body. Shudu, on the other hand, seems like a more clear-cut case of blaxploitation. The optics are pretty stark. A white British man creating a 3D character that looks like a black woman. Indeed, the critic Lauren Michelle Johnson aligned Shudu within a history of blaxploitation, writing in The New Yorker, quote, "The American historian Eric Lott has argued that black-faced minstrels who originated during the antebellum period allowed white audiences to indulge their intense fascination with blackness without having to interact with actual black people. I thought of this history when looking at images of Shudu. It is difficult to conceive of what virtual celebrities actually are. and thus even more complex to consider how they function as vehicles and impediments to representation. Some questions that I think we should consider. Should we condemn virtual celebrities as yet another notch in a history of consumerist appropriations of cultural identity, of cultural diversity and identity, or should we understand them as post-humanist, post-truth cyborgs who represent the growing majority of bi- and multiracial Americans? How does the nature and valence of representation change when what is representing the representor, when that cannot be distinguished from what is represented, when the representation itself is designed to be confused for the represented? And finally, how do these synthetic celebrities fit into a history of consumer representation? So, I'm going to briefly talk about two examples of consumerist representation. On the left, we have Barbie from 1959, and on the right, we have the first black Barbie, Christie, who debuted in 1968. So in the fall of 1990, Mattel announced a new marketing strategy to boost its sales. The corporation would, quote, go ethnic in its advertising by launching an ad campaign for the black and Hispanic versions of the already popular doll Barbie. Despite the existence of black, Asian, and Latina Barbies prior to the fall of 1990s, Mattel's print and TV ads featured only white dolls. In what Newsweek described as an attempt to capitalize on ethnic spending power, Mattel began placing ads for multicultural Barbies in such Afrocentric market publications as Esten and on such Latin-oriented shows as Pepe Plata, after market research revealed that most black and Hispanic consumers were unaware of the company's other dolls. In her 1994 article, Dyes and Dolls, Multicultural Barbie and the Merchandising of Difference, critic Ann Ducille wrote, quote, someone asked me the other day if a black doll that looks like a white doll isn't better than no black doll at all. I must admit that I have no ready answer for this and a number of other questions posed by my own critique. Although, as I acknowledged in the beginning, the dolls I played with as a child were white, I still remember the first time I saw a black doll. To me, she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I wanted her desperately, and I was never again satisfied with white Betsy Wetsy and blonde blue-eyed Patty Play Pal. She was something else and something other, like me, and that, I imagine, was the source of her charm and my desire. Yet these dolls are at once a symbol and a symptom of what multiculturalism has become at the hand of contemporary commodity culture, an easy and immensely profitable way to way off the hook of Eurocentrism that gives us the face of cultural diversity without the particulars of racial difference. So here's another example, Sims and Second Life. So these are two mod boards. And in recent years, several digital games have emerged that fulfill representation and identification interests of traditionally othered audiences, The Sims being the most prominent example. Sims has been praised for being socially progressive given its liberal views towards same-sex relationships, absence of racial stereotyping, and non-sexualized presentation of women. Although these progressive articulations are a step in the right direction in terms of the positive representation, I want to argue that the reasoning behind such liberal progressiveness does not necessarily reflect a sudden change in cultural liberalism, but instead reflects a change in how traditionally marginalized people are marketed to in late capitalism. But there's a profound difference between The Sims and Barbies and what we're talking about today. What we're reckoning with today cannot be mistaken or confused as real. In fact, it's very fake. It's representative. But most people don't know that. These are just a selection of comments that I literally screenshotted off Instagram yesterday of people mistaking Shudu, Michaela, and the hundreds of other virtual celebrities for real people. It used to be that real-looking fake humans, avatars, were confined to video games, were confined to Barbies, Disney parks, movies, music videos. We could turn them off or leave them behind. Now they occupy spaces once reserved for real people experiencing real-life things, say, standing next to Michael Jackson. Michaela and other synthetic celebrities represent the climax of the widening between the simulacrum and the real that precedes the simulacrum, as argued by Jean Baudrillard in Simulacra and Simulation, a book I read this week. In the age of mass media, much of our perception of the world comes indirectly via simulacra rather than direct first-hand experience. When you watch events unfold in the news, you're not observing reality, you're observing a simulacrum of reality. But that distinction cannot be made in images like this, or images like this, which is Pearl, another synthetic celebrity who's wearing a t-shirt with Michaela's likeness on the t-shirt. Or another virtual celebrity, Immigram, who is so lifelike that, in fact, she has a Zepeto account in which her avatar likeness is made, quote, more cartoonish. So I'm going to now just talk again a little bit about Michaela and Shudu in the 2 minutes that I've left. So this is a Michaela post from last April. And in the caption, I'm not sure I can comfortably identify as a woman of color. Quote, brown was a choice made by a corporation. Quote, woman was an option on a computer screen. My identity was a choice Brud made in order to sell me to brands to appear, quote unquote, woke, which is funny because Brud wrote that caption. Claiming identity is a complicated, fluid, and complex process. Brud has expressed altruistic goals. The co-founders, Trevor McFedries, who is black, and his co-founder, Sarah DeCou, who is Latina, issued a statement this spring comparing the impact they hope to have to, quote, Will and Grace, a seemingly frivolous media connection that had real-life impact on marriage equality. Luckily, Michaela is a pixelated simulacrum. She doesn't have to deal with the consequences of radical passion and being multiracial in America. And so the questions arise. Does Michaela represent the American multiracial experience? Does she take employment and capital away from multicultural influencers and models? Does she complicate common Instagram styles, trends, and practices, as well as ideas about humanity, femininity, and individuality, or does she endorse them? Likewise, Shudu is another simulacral surface, and we can notice that pre-programmed difference in Shudo seems only to be included if it is sellable and fashionable. This is a quote from Kemi Alamuro, who's a critic, and I really agree with what he's writing here. The state of multiculturalism in this day and age is that differentness available to synthetic celebrities like that available to Barbie or The Sims does not represent what Anne Duciel calls the triumph of difference, but rather that of similarity, a mediated text that no matter what its dye job ultimately must be readable as white. So I'll just skip to the end. And yesterday, KFC debuted their CGI influencer, so you know that if KFC is doing it, it can't be all that good. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So at this point, I'd like to invite all of our presenters back up here if they want to take a seat in front of the screen. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions, concerns, comments that anyone might have. So just give everyone a minute to come up here. I'll walk around, yeah.
So thanks to everybody. That was really interesting. My question is for the first presenter, Sinha. Hello. So it seems that you're saying that if we're not fully ensconced, at least we're dealing with a regime of truth that is sort of like a hyper-reified version of the Enlightenment. So my question for you is, do you think that there's a way for people to meaningfully challenge this without making recourse to mysticism or what others might consider to simply be a mystical or obfuscating sort of argument? And what sorts of popular examples or modern tropes would you use to push back on this, the false binary that you established, where really both sides are arguing for on an Enlightenment sort of logic? How would you push back against that without seeming overly mystical? That would be the word.
Sure. I am very wary of how, we don't want to fall into that caricature of postmodern relativism where it's as if we just want to say everybody's irrational and everybody's just as wrong as everybody else, because that's not true. And that's not getting us anywhere, right? So we want to avoid that. But equally, I'm trying to point out the danger in saying we know what truth is and objectivity is, and some stupid and malicious people just don't have it. Again, I don't think that's the effective strategy. And here I come back to the work of Lauren Berlant, which often asks questions like, how do we keep ourselves going, and how do we continue to make our crazy everyday lives make some kind of sense, even as the American dream doesn't work out for us, or even though we continue to be vulnerable, or even though things don't make sense a lot of the time. And here I come to this point where, so many of these technologies, like a lot of the self-tracking stuff, a lot of that technology is never really going to work as intended for most people most of the time, right? So we're always asked to imagine how Duplex or Google Glasses or Alexa is going to work when it works perfectly, just like in the ads. But most of the time, the social impact of these technologies or these networks is very, very different from that. And I think they get there, actually they're able to mystify themselves through this kind of gap. They use that gap very strategically. And I think my recommendation there, or my suggestion there, would be, can we look at the gap instead? And can we focus on not what these technologies are supposed to do under ideal conditions, and not what our journalism and science is meant to do under perfect conditions, but how they're actually playing out and the effect that they really have in the present, and use that gap as a way to say, we're not going to get to a place where everybody knows what truth is, but can we do a little bit better than what we're doing now? And it seems like surely we can do better than we are.
Do we have another question? Yeah. I didn't see a hand. Sure.
It's kind of a comment question. I'll be that person at the conference today. But I think it's really interesting that these people who are creating these sort of like racialized internet or AI celebrities or generated celebrities are saying that they are not racializing them, but they're clearly racialized. So I think that contradiction is, I don't know, really interesting. And then I'm wondering if you have seen racialized discourse in relation to them. So like, are they being racialized by people who are upset or offended, right? Like, how does that work? Especially thinking about this idea that we're living in a post-racial society, which we do not. So are there ever instances when they're getting or receiving hate speech, or like, what does that look like?
So as regard to your comment, I totally agree. And I think that's another sort of interesting layer, which is that the consumerism now isn't just about racializing the characters themselves, but it's actually about consumerizing the discourse about it, right? Like, so turning the sort of like meta irony of Michaela acknowledging that the choices that were made about her are in order to sell her as a sort of like female body on Instagram, that in and of itself is also a sales tactic, right? Like, that's a way for Brud as a company to acknowledge what they're doing and then at the same time kind of wink and be like, and isn't it cool? And as regard to your second question, I haven't seen instances of that kind of discourse, but your question just made me thought of something else, which is that a lot of anger is directed towards the influencers as regards to their realness. So the most common hate that any of the influencers get is when they're called robots. So Brud plays into this. One of their other characters, Blocko, acknowledges his robotness. Twitch live streams on Twitch about being a robot, and they play into this. But the vitriol and hate with which these characters are called robot can't be mistaken for anything except otherization. And I think the idea that you would call someone a robot when in reality they're meant to look exactly like the rest of us is such a demeaning and disparaging way to go about building a brand, to use no other language, that I think that discourse itself probably answers the question that you're asking.
Do we have another question?
So just to kind of add on to what you had just said about like using robot as an insult, right? So sometimes I find myself, deep in like comment threads on political memes with, all kinds of like right-wing, ridiculous comments and everything like that. But I've become really good at spotting bots. I'm like, you have 0 followers and you're following 324 people. You have like 2 posts. You have no profile picture. Like, you're obviously a bot. So sometimes I find myself being like, okay, but you're a bot, so, you don't matter. And I guess I'm kind of like, I've gotten responses from bots literally being like, so what if I'm a bot? What does that have anything to do with the fact that Donald Trump is this, that, and the other thing? And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, how do you kind of see those things coming into attention with the virtual influencers.
Totally. I think that's an awesome observation. I think the thing to remember about virtual influencers is that as of yet, they're not actually artificially intelligent, right? Like, so there's a team in Los Angeles in an amazing loft, I imagine, that's on Maya and on Blender, like rigging these characters, and the captions are written by people, and the images are manufactured by people. And so at no point is there an artificially intelligent component. I can tell you for sure that that's what the company is going out and saying to people, what the company will look like, right? It's Disney, but imagine if Mickey Mouse got to decide what his plot line was. And so to your comment about bots in and of themselves, right? Like bots taking on personality, those are sentient, are artificially intelligent choices being made. Michaela is nothing more than like, I don't know, a marionette puppet, right? Yeah.
Hi, this is actually for the whole panel. I work as a sort of news and culture curator at what, full disclosure, used to be a BetaWorks funded company. And in the case of all of your talks, actually, we have dealt with trying to relate these topics to our audience in a fast and digestible way, assuming zero knowledge of, say, what Alex Jones's deal is, or what a digital influencer is, or not knowing what our audience is going to come to us with in terms of their feelings about deepfakes or UFOs, whether or not they're real. And when there's a long read or a detailed explainer, we can put that up in the hopes that this is actually going to be a primer for this topic for people, especially if it's quality. But when we're just, asked to say, is a, say, for instance, Steve Buscemi deepfake on, I believe it was Jennifer Lawrence, newsworthy, and how to relate that without just stripping it entirely of context. I wonder, in any of these cases, and the subjects you spoke to, have you seen really effective ways of quickly distilling these conversations down for an audience so that you're not just putting information out into the void where you're not going to know if what you're doing is, in a sense, sort of promoting the more negative aspects of, say, deepfakes versus appreciating it from this standpoint of, as you discussed in your talk with respect to deepfakes, a more nuanced conversation. In any of these cases, sort of the quick way of getting people on board, or at least interested in diving deeper into those subjects.
Sure, yeah. I think when you're talking about pornographic deepfakes, you're really dealing with two injured parties, and that's whoever's face is being superimposed upon the video and whoever's being decapitated by the video. And what I would love to see is more sex workers and more porn performers being consulted in the reporting on deepfakes. Like, I think it's as easy as that, because there have been very few quotable, sort of re-centering the focus on the fact that 50% of the transgression that is a deepfake is not really being addressed. The focus isn't entirely on celebrities. It's a clickbaity problem. Yeah.
Just to add very, very quickly on the whole far-right kind of aspect of it, and this is a problem I faced recently while speaking to Canadian journalists about the New Zealand shootings, for example, where there was a clear attempt to garner attention in a very, very explicit way, so on and so forth. And the conversation we had was around how I would say one of the biggest things we can do is we don't have to engage the content of what is being produced by fake news peddlers every single time. We don't have to answer point by point, get into this kind of equivalent of a quote monster, talking about why they're wrong and why this is a problematic opinion every single time. There are times and places to do that, but I think there are also times and places where we look beyond that content and make a comment about the action or the effect or the problematic trend that's there. Because, for example, the New Zealand killer wanted us to talk endlessly about his name and about his ideas. Anders Breivik wanted his ideas to be taken very seriously. And I think there's a way for us to talk about the dangers of this while not going on and on and on about what exactly they've said, because that's a way for them to suck you in. The classic trolling book, right? They want to say something really seriously wrong and offensive, sometimes knowing that it's wrong, in order to make you talk about that all day long. So that's one key thing that I've been insisting on recently, and I think it's great that the Prime Minister of New Zealand, where I'm from actually, took that step of saying, I'm not going to use his name.
Not really sure how this applies to UFOs. You mean what's a good way of like delivering and synthesizing information without like facilitating spread of misinformation? Oh, I don't know. Well, with UFO communities, I think it's hard because they're kind of like the perfect conspiracy group in the sense that any information against them is just sort of like, I mean, what's the point? And it's kind of dismissed, and any information that kind of lends credence to the ideas is part of the general plan of like disclosure, like government disclosure over time, that like eventually they will reveal all of the secrets of UFOs and alien technology. You just can't do it all at once. So anything that does come out is like part of the whole scheme.
We have another question over here.
We should talk more about UFOs, right?
Hi, Jen
They
Greigel,
hurt no
Syracuse
one.
University. I've done a lot of research on Lil Michaela especially. So the curious point here is that she's Instagram verified, right? So in order to do that, the company had to designate her either as a public influencer, a celebrity, or a global marketing brand. So I just want to put that out to you. Do you either kind of categorize her as two human type attributes or one that's clearly Brett's brand? What is she? And what is the role of the platform in mediating our reality?
Well, it's not like Instagram's going to make a good choice on any given day. Yeah, I think, again, a really insightful point. And to just sort of add on to that, Michaela, as a public influencer verified by Instagram, legally should be liable under the same FCC and FTC regulations that influencers are liable to on Instagram, right? That's why you have to see, paid or SponCon or whatever, but you don't see that. And that's because Michaela's not an actual person who can be actually, prosecuted by the FTC or the FCC. And I think there's a lot of interesting legal issues on the regulatory front around thinking about non-human influencers that also then, of course, reflect the platform's responsibility. And I think, looking at platforms, and especially Facebook and Instagram, from the regulatory perspective, that is just like, let's just like break up the companies before we even get to like the point where we're thinking about whether little Michaela should be, paying tax.
We have time for one more question.
Well, I do think I think it's also really important to continue to foreground the platforms and to continue to foreground the conversations about that. I've heard a lot of people on panels today specifically bring up safe harbor, which I think spans a lot of the issues that have been presented both in this panel and in other panels that I've seen today. And I mean, at least reflecting back on deepfakes, leaving it entirely up to, I'd mentioned deputizing these platforms to make these decisions on behalf of all of us, it is troublesome in a few ways. First of all, the fact that deepfakes, you're modularizing pornography in a way that's cheap and effective. Like, theoretically, deepfakes should actually be the perfect pornography vehicle for these platforms. And so for them to pretend and to sort of posture as though they're going to be banning deepfakes under non-consensual pornography clauses, but then allow them to crop up again and again and again, it fundamentally is a problem with safe harbor protecting them from their actions, and a whole lot of posturing about protecting the victims of deepfakes while simultaneously profiting off of circulation of deepfakes. And so I think until the legislation changes, that's just going to continue.
One technique I've seen being discussed recently is called prospiracy theories, which is basically where graphic designers are co-opting the language of conspiracy theorists to talk about things that we think of as true. So they'll have like a poster that uses like, it looks really conspiracy, and it's like, what if Barack Obama was actually born in the United States, right? So I'm curious if you think this is like a good technique for kind of like bringing more people into the fold of what we think of as like truth, or if this is kind of like a reactionary thing where we'll just get sucked into a black hole of confusing like design languages and how we make sense of like what's going on out there.
I mean, part of the risk here is, I mean, this is the ye old Nietzsche cliche where, you know, you stare into the abyss too long and you become what you stare into. And part of what's been happening here is that because truth or what you claim as truth can now be weaponized, there's also a very emotional loop of trying to score points, right? So you want to create these memes that are funny and they have zingers in them, but you also want to make people who agree with you delight in this. You want to take people down. And there's this kind of element of it's only inviting further affective polarization, as the political scientists like to talk about it, where, again, you become more and more primed into this kind of daily cycle where your satisfaction isn't in having that genuine persuasion with the other side. Your satisfaction is in what new creative ways can I call Donald a total loser on Twitter tomorrow and get all these likes from everybody else. And so that ties into some of the other things that we've been talking about strategies for engagement, strategies for, and again, I think I would say, what kind of affective loop or what kind of emotional loop should we be having? And I do think we need to be very wary about, people on the left, I think we need to be very wary about looking at Mueller or things like that and saying, I want to feel good, I want to see Donald being taken down. It's an understandable sentiment, but you've also got to be aware that a parallel of that sentiment is fueling a lot of that on the other side as well. And a way to do it, I think, is break out of that a little bit and, I mean, this is going to sound pithy, but maybe focus a bit on what we can dream about and what we can fantasize about in terms of a better society, rather than, again, being sucked into refuting every single point that, quote unquote, the other side is making. I would apply that to both political sides or more than both sides.
So I do want to acknowledge that we're at time. I want to thank our presenters for some wonderful presentations. And I do want to thank all of you for coming here today, and you're welcome to come up and talk with them and if you have any additional questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily.
She sounds like she's really busy. Really? Yeah, I don't know if she'd make it to Queens, but she says, yeah, thank you. Hi and love. That's nice. Yeah. Yeah. Hello. Hi. Nice to meet you.